The loudest laugh came from my mother. She pointed at me across the Christmas dinner table as my younger sister smirked and said, 35 years old and still single. At this point, she should just accept she's going to die alone. The room erupted with laughter. My father shook his head. My cousins looked away. No one expected me to respond. I calmly folded my napkin, looked my mother straight in the eyes, and said 6 words that instantly killed every smile in the room. I've been married for almost 11 years. The silence that followed exposed a family secret they'd spent years pretending never existed. Christmas at my parents' house had always looked perfect from the outside. The lights were wrapped neatly around the porch columns. Wreaths hung from every window. My mother insisted on using the same handmade ornaments she'd collected over 30 years, and every room smelled like cinnamon, pine, and roasted turkey. If someone had walked through the front door that evening, they would have thought they were looking at the definition of a happy American family. I knew better. I parked my SUV across the street and sat there for a moment, watching my parents' house glow against the December snow. 35 years old. A successful financial consultant. Owner of my own home. Completely debt-free. Healthy. Happy. Yet, somehow, none of those things mattered whenever I walked into that house. To my family, I was simply the daughter who had never settled down. I grabbed the apple pie I'd baked that morning, took a deep breath, and walked inside. There she is, my mother called from the kitchen. She kissed my cheek quickly before taking the pie from my hands. You still make the best crust. Thanks, Mom. Before I could say another word, my younger sister Emily appeared wearing an expensive cream-colored sweater and carrying a toddler on one hip. Look who finally made it, she laughed. Emily was 32, married, 2 beautiful children. Every family gathering somehow became another celebration of her life. Mom beamed whenever she looked at her. Dad constantly bragged about Emily's husband, Ryan, who had recently become a partner at a large law firm. I genuinely liked Ryan. He was kind. The problem wasn't Emily's success. The problem was that my family acted like hers was the only life worth admiring. Emily handed her daughter to Mom before turning toward me. So, she smiled. Any exciting news? I smiled politely. Work's been busy. She laughed. No, I meant real news. Dad chuckled from the living room without even looking up from the football game. You know exactly what she means. There it was. It never took long. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas. The conversation always found its way back to my relationship status. I'm doing great, I answered. I didn't ask if you were doing great, Emily said with a grin. I asked if you were dating anybody. No. She dramatically sighed. Still. Mom immediately stepped in. Emily. I almost thought she was about to defend me. Instead, she smiled at me sympathetically. Honey, she's only asking because she worries. I forced another smile. I know. The truth was, Emily didn't worry. She enjoyed it. Being the younger sister who had reached every milestone first had become part of her identity. Marriage, children, family vacations, matching Christmas cards. She had everything our parents had always imagined. And me? I had become their unfinished project. Dinner was finally ready. The dining table looked beautiful. Fine china, crystal glasses, candles burning softly between evergreen branches. 4 generations of family filled every chair. Laughter echoed through the room as everyone passed bowls of mashed potatoes and roasted vegetables. For a little while, everything felt peaceful. Then my uncle asked the question. So, Claire? He smiled warmly. Anyone special in your life these days? Before I could answer, Emily laughed. Not a quiet laugh. A loud one. The kind meant for an audience. Oh, Uncle Mark, she said. Claire doesn't need anyone. She raised her wine glass. She's already 35 and still single. Several cousins laughed awkwardly. Emily wasn't finished. It must be tough spending Christmas alone every year. More laughter spread around the table. Someone muttered, Ouch. I looked down at my plate. Not because I was embarrassed. Because I already knew what was coming next. Mom waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Emily," she said between little laughs. "She's just teasing." Dad smiled into his mashed potatoes. Nobody told Emily to stop. Nobody changed the subject. Nobody noticed that I'd quietly set my fork on the plate. For years, I had defended myself, explained myself, argued. Tonight, I felt strangely calm. I reached for my water glass, took one slow sip, then I placed it gently back onto the table. The sound of the glass touching the wood was somehow louder than all the laughter. Every conversation slowly faded. I looked around the table, at my mother, my father, my sister, the cousins, the aunts, the uncles. Then I smiled. A small, peaceful smile. "Don't worry about me," I said softly. "I've actually been married for a long time." Silence. Emily blinked. The smile disappeared from her face. Dad lowered his fork. My mother's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. My sister stared at me as if she'd misheard every word. Finally, she whispered, "What?" I simply folded my hands together and met her eyes. Because after 15 years of assumptions, they were finally about to hear the truth they had never once bothered to ask for. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the crackling fireplace behind my father. Emily looked around the table before laughing nervously. "Okay," she said. That was funny. I didn't laugh. Neither did anyone else. Dad slowly lowered his fork onto his plate. "What exactly do you mean you've been married?" I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. "I mean exactly what I said. I've been married for almost 11 years. Emily stared at me. "No." She shook her head. "That's impossible. Mom would know. Dad would know. We would have been invited." I looked at her calmly. "You would have. If any of you had wanted to meet him." The room became even quieter. Mom frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" I looked at my parents for several seconds before answering. "Do you remember Daniel?" The color drained from my mother's face. Emily stopped smiling. Dad leaned back in his chair. Nobody answered. Of course they remembered him. They had simply spent years pretending he never existed. I met Daniel 12 years earlier at a volunteer fundraiser organized by our local library. I'd signed up to help with financial literacy workshops. He was there coaching teenagers who were preparing for college interviews. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to impress anyone. He simply listened when people spoke. After spending years dating men who loved talking about themselves, that alone caught my attention. We spent the afternoon organizing books and laughing over terrible coffee. 3 weeks later, he asked me to dinner. It wasn't an expensive restaurant. Just a quiet family-owned Italian place with checkered tablecloths and homemade bread. By the end of the evening, I knew something was different. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove I was worth loving. A month later, he told me something that made him nervous. "I need you to know something before this goes any further." He took a slow breath. "I was married. My wife passed away from cancer 4 years ago. And I'm raising our little girl." I remember reaching across the table and taking his hand. "Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me." His daughter, Sophie, had just turned 6. She was shy. She loved books. She collected seashells even though they lived hundreds of miles from the ocean. The first time I met her, she handed me a crayon drawing she'd made of the 3 of us standing beneath a giant rainbow. She'd written one sentence across the top. "I hope you come back." I still have that picture. When I introduced Daniel to my parents, everything changed. Mom barely smiled. Dad spent the entire dinner asking about Daniel's finances. Emily pulled me aside afterward. "Seriously? You're dating a widower? With a kid? You can do so much better." Mom agreed. She called me the next morning. "Honey, you deserve someone without so much baggage." Baggage. That's the word she used. Not father. Not husband. Not someone rebuilding his life. Just baggage. For months, they criticized everything. They questioned his income, his age, his responsibilities. They even suggested that raising another woman's child would ruin my future. Every family dinner became another attempt to convince me to leave him. Eventually, Daniel noticed. One evening he asked quietly, "Am I making your life harder?" I smiled. "No, they are." He nodded sadly. "I don't want you losing your family because of me." "You won't," I promised. "I'll never let that happen." Looking back, I kept half of that promise. I never lost him, but I slowly lost them. When Daniel proposed, it wasn't in front of a crowd. There were no photographers, no orchestra, just the three of us walking through a botanical garden on a warm spring afternoon. Sophie handed me a small wooden box she'd been hiding behind her back. Inside was a simple ring. Daniel smiled nervously. "We're already a family. I was just wondering if you'd like to make it official." Before I could answer, Sophie wrapped her little arms around my waist. "Please say yes." I couldn't stop crying. We were married 6 weeks later at the county courthouse. There were 9 people there. Daniel's parents, his sister, 2 close friends, Sophie, the judge, us. My side of the room remained completely empty. Not because they weren't invited. Every one of them had received an invitation. Mom said she was too disappointed. Dad claimed he already had golf plans. Emily texted one sentence: "Call me when this phase is over." So we stopped asking. We stopped explaining. We stopped chasing people who had already decided our happiness didn't count. Life became wonderfully quiet. Daniel and I built our home one ordinary day at a time. Saturday breakfasts, family movie nights, camping trips, helping Sophie with homework, celebrating every little victory together. Years passed faster than I expected. Sophie grew from the little girl with crayons into a determined young woman. Last spring, she graduated from medical school. I reached into my purse, slowly, without saying another word. Then I placed a stack of photographs in the center of the Christmas table. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, anniversary dinners. Daniel smiling beside me, Sophie wearing her graduation gown while hugging both of us. Every picture captured a life filled with love. Emily picked up the top photograph with trembling fingers. Mom covered her mouth. Dad couldn't take his eyes off the pictures. I looked around the silent room and said quietly, "I wasn't hiding my marriage. You were simply too busy deciding what my life looked like to ever ask me how I was actually living it." No one reached for the photographs. It was as if touching them would force everyone at the table to admit they'd been wrong. My mother was the first to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know." I looked at her gently. "You could have." She lowered her eyes. Emily finally broke the silence. "This is ridiculous." She pushed one of the photographs back toward me. "If you were really happy, why wouldn't you tell us?" I almost smiled. "I did." She frowned. "No, you didn't." I stopped after nobody wanted to listen. Dad rubbed his forehead. "What are you talking about?" I looked around the table. "Do either of you remember my 31st birthday?" Mom blinked. "I think so. You invited me to dinner." She nodded. I asked if Daniel and Sophie could come. Mom's face slowly changed. I continued quietly. "You said it should just be immediate family." Emily looked uncomfortable. I wasn't finished. The following year, Dad retired. I asked again if Daniel could celebrate with us. Dad looked down. "You told me there wouldn't be enough room." I paused. 2 days later, Emily posted pictures online. There were 23 people there. No one denied it. Another memory surfaced. 3 years ago, I invited all of you to Sophie's high school graduation. Emily stared at the table. "You never answered." Mom whispered. I finished the sentence for her. "You thought if you ignored him long enough, I'd eventually leave." She covered her face with both hands. A tear slipped through her fingers. "I never wanted to lose you." "You didn't lose me," I answered softly. "You kept pushing away the people I loved. Eventually, I stopped asking you to make room for us." The room felt painfully still. Even the children at the far end of the house had gone quiet. Dad leaned back slowly. "When did Sophie graduate medical school?" "Last spring." His eyes widened. "Medical school?" I nodded. "She starts her residency next month." Emily looked genuinely shocked. I thought she was still a little girl. I smiled. So did I. It happened faster than either of us expected. Mom picked up another photograph. This one showed Daniel standing behind me at a beach, both of us laughing while Sophie buried our feet in the sand. Mom stared at it for a long time. He looks happy. He is. And so am I. Another long silence settled over the room. Finally, Mom looked directly at me. I'm sorry. There was no dramatic speech. No excuses. Just 2 words. Simple. Honest. I judged him before I ever knew him. I judged your marriage before it even began. I thought I was protecting you. I nodded. I know. Emily folded her arms. I still think you should have fought harder. I looked at her calmly. For what? So we'd know. You already knew enough. You knew I loved him. You simply decided your opinion mattered more than my decision. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time all evening, she had nothing to say. My phone buzzed beside my plate. The sound startled everyone. I glanced at the screen and smiled. Mom noticed. Daniel? I nodded. He always checks in around this time. She looked away. What did he say? I unlocked the phone and read the message aloud. Dinner's ready whenever you are. Sophie's pie came out perfect this time. Drive safely. We love you. No one spoke. I slipped the phone back into my purse. Then I stood. I should head home. Mom quickly stood too. So soon? I smiled kindly. I've already missed dessert. Emily looked confused. But we haven't served dessert. I know. I'm talking about mine. A few people smiled for the first time all evening. Not because the moment was funny, because they finally understood. My real Christmas wasn't waiting inside this house. It was waiting somewhere else. I picked up my coat. Before opening the front door, I turned back one last time. I don't hate any of you. I honestly don't. But I spent years trying to earn acceptance from people who kept asking me to choose between my family and the man who became my family. I finally realized something. Being loved by the right people is worth far more than being approved by the wrong ones. No one stopped me. No one argued. As I stepped outside, snow had begun falling again. The cold air felt strangely peaceful. 25 minutes later, I pulled into my driveway. Before I could unlock the front door, it swung open. Daniel stood there wearing an apron covered in flour. You made it. Behind him, Sophie ran into the hallway. Merry Christmas. She wrapped me in the same kind of hug she'd given me since she was 6 years old. The smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh pie drifted through the house. Laughter filled every room. Not forced laughter. Not laughter at someone else's expense. Just happiness. Daniel slipped his hand into mine. You okay? I looked around our home. The framed photographs. The stockings hanging above the fireplace. The family we'd built together one ordinary day at a time. Then I smiled. More than okay. That Christmas, I finally understood something I'd spent years searching for. Some people spend their lives chasing approval from those who refuse to see them. Others quietly build a life so full of love that approval no longer matters. My family thought I was spending Christmas alone. The truth was, I had been home all along.